Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of your Bish Therapist podcast. I am your host, Melissa Reich, your Bish Therapist, a real life therapist turned pop culture aficionado, serving clinical interpretations and hot takes on all things pop culture. And today's episode is going to be a lot. I'm going to be talking about Vanderpump Rules Reunion Part 1, and The Valley, which I know this podcast comes out on Tuesdays. So by the time you're listening to this, there will be a new Vanderpump Rules Reunion Part 2 and The Valley on Tuesday evening. So the good news about this is that I was just on Mandy Slutzker's podcast, Is This Real Life with Mandy Slutzker? And that episode, you can listen to it anywhere you listen to podcasts. We talked about Vanderpump Rules and The Valley and a little bit about Jersey. And I did say some interesting things there. So Mandy, the reason I'm sharing this is Mandy is coming on my podcast this week. So today I'm going to be talking about, kind of old news essentially, but Mandy and I will be talking about Vanderpump Rules Reunion Part 2, The Valley, and Summer House. So today, here's what I'm saying. Today, it's going to be Vanderpump Rules Reunion Part 1, The Valley, and if I have time, Summer House. If I don't have time, Mandy is very into Summer House, so we may lean into that. And especially at this point, if I'm being honest, I feel like I can only say so much about Lindsay and Carl because it's like every week it's just like empathy fatigue, and there's still so many more episodes of this plus the reunion, and it's like, okay, we get it. They shouldn't be together. They both play a role. Like, I don't know how much more I can say about that, but we did really see some interesting information about Kyle and Amanda that I do have a lot to say about. So let me just get right into the meat and potatoes of this whole thing. Let me just get started because, oh my gosh, I have so much to say. So I'm going to start out by giving a trigger warning because through the Vanderpump Rules stuff, I'm going to be talking about a couple things. I'm going to be talking about suicidal ideation. I'm going to be talking about that because it was brought up on the reunion. Was it weaponized? Was it not? I'm here to give you all my thoughts on that. And I have primarily, in a lot of my career, I have dealt with a lot of crisis and suicidal ideation and things like that. And so I tend to have my finger on the pulse of those conversations just because I have so much clinical experience with it. And for whatever reason, it was just like in my career, I attracted really challenging, and not that suicidal ideation is challenging, by the way, it's actually quite common. So my point is that I'm going to be talking about some tough stuff. So suicidal ideation, I'm going to be talking about postpartum OCD and postpartum mental health issues. And I am also going to be talking about grooming because Tom and Lala had this argument about it, and Tom was completely wrong. Lala, she was on the right side of that argument, but she also wasn't totally correct. So I'm going to be sharing information about grooming from the RAINN website, RAINN, RAINN.org. They are one of the most reputable sites in terms of research and information about sexual abuse and things like that. So there's going to be a lot of tough topics talked about. So you always know I talk about it with respect, dignity. We're going to talk about it in a way to help people understand, but at the same time, I always say you got to take care of yourselves first and foremost. So this is your opportunity to take a beat if you need to. Please take care of yourselves. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's get right into it. Tom Sandoval was talking about a lot of topic was about suicidal ideation. Tom said that he was suicidal. Lisa encouraged or basically told Scheana and Lala, like, you need to help him, which is, I didn't love that in the flashback just because that's a lot to put on somebody else. Like, my mental health is my responsibility, and everybody just needs to be accountable for that. So I think that, but to no surprise, Lisa, I think, struggles to take some accountability sometimes too. So she likes to push things off on people. But we saw the flashbacks of Tom, talking about his suicidal ideation, Ariana, having her struggles. And so the topic came up about Tom weaponizing Ariana's suicidal ideation last season. So Tom says, "I'm curious as to how I weaponized your suicidal thoughts." And then it cut to video of him actively engaging in that behavior last year. So for those who don't remember, last year, Tom Sandoval claimed that he could not break up with Ariana because when he tried, she became suicidal. He discussed this on camera without her knowledge or consent and used it as an excuse to partially blame her for his behaviors. So when Andy challenged Tom about this, he said, "I brought it up because I felt it was used against me in a textbook manipulation tactic way. And when someone in a relationship wants out, and then Lisa interrupts him," which annoyed me greatly because I wanted to hear the rest of that thought. The rest of that thought needed to be said. Because it sounded like to me he was just continually doubling down on weaponizing her mental health as a reason why he couldn't break up with her. And I just won't stand for that. I'm sorry. I just won't stand for it. It's just obscene. So here's what I'm going to say about this, because I had a lot of people on my Instagram ask me legitimately, "Well, are you saying it's okay to, if someone's breaking up with you, to say, I'm going to harm myself?" And I'm like, okay, let me break this down here. My number one point is that Tom, we basically see him admitting that he did weaponize her suicidal ideation because he's like, "I learned it from watching you." Do you remember those old commercials in the 80s where it's like a kid yells at a parent and it's like, "I learned it from watching you, okay?" I feel like, okay, this is not funny, but that just tickled my funny bone. But Tom did weaponize her suicidal ideation, discussing it on camera without her knowledge and consent. And he did use it as an excuse to blame her for why he couldn't break up with her and continue to have an affair. That's insane. But here's what I'm going to say. What Scheana said to Tom is exactly right in the flashback from last year. If that was really what happened, then Tom should have said, "Scheana, Lala," gotten her family, her friends involved and said, "Listen, this is what's going on. I need you to help her, but I need to take a step back," right? That is what a healthy, mature adult would have done. But I'm not, and here's the other hugely important point of what I'm saying. I don't think that Ariana did that. Here is my honest assessment of what I'm hearing. Knowing that what's real on reality TV isn't always real in real life. I know that. We see a snippet of these people. I'm giving my thoughts based on sometimes incomplete information. And, I am always mindful of that. But here is what I gathered after watching part 1 of the reunion is that Ariana had been struggling, as she has mentioned, and she's such a great advocate she struggles with anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. And to be clear, suicidal ideation is when you have thoughts of harming yourself with plan and intent, but it could also just be thoughts of hurting yourself without plan, without intent. There's a lot of different ways to experience this. And as someone who, I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, I have major depression, and major depressive disorder is the name of it. And, I've go through the ringer with my health and I've had a lot of trauma. So I know about it personally and professionally. And so what I want to say is that people get really nervous when we talk about it. And sometimes, even if you listen to some podcasts or some people talk about it, they'll like whisper when it comes to it. And it's like, when people like Ariana, Tom, whoever is experiencing suicidal ideation deserves to talk about it from a place of not feeling judged and not being pathologized, because there's a lot of reasons why people experience suicidal ideation. I believe it's when, well, first of all, depression lies to us. Depression and anxiety lies to us, period. They literally, it changes our brain and it makes us think and believe things that normally in a healthier space we really would never believe, that we're not worthwhile, that people would be better off without us. None of that is true. Your brains are lying to you. Anyone listening to this right now who is struggling, please know, A, I'm going to list some resources. B, your brains are lying to you. And you're worthwhile, you're valuable. I'm going to give an example, okay? If I had given up, I wouldn't be doing this. Let me just be clear. I went through a really severe depression during the pandemic. I've already talked about this. I'm not going to go back into it. But this career now that you're seeing was born of me crawling out of the pits of hell of depression and PTSD. And this is why I'm here. So if you think you have nothing else to offer, you couldn't be more wrong. And what most people, myself included, never even occurred to us is that some of our best days are ahead of us. It never occurred to me. So if you're listening and you're struggling, please know there is light at the end of the tunnel. Some of your best days are ahead of you and you are important. I just want to say that. So going back to my take on this is that Ariana was struggling, right? She lost her grandmother. She had to put her dog down. Oh God, all of those were such hard scenes. And I could just feel from her pores how much she was struggling. And I believe that what Tom meant was, I don't think he actually tried to break up with her and she said, I am going to end my life if you do that. I think she was struggling with suicidality and had told Tom about that. And he privately was like, well, I can't break up with her because of X, Y, and Z. That's my take. I don't know if that's accurate or not. And listen, it's really honestly nobody's business. So I don't want to speculate too much about it, but the point of this all is he did weaponize it. Whether you like it or not, he did weaponize it. And so, in my opinion, it confirms that Tom intended to weaponize her suicidal ideation because he didn't believe her claims. So, and also, just like a side note, Tom speaking about like textbook manipulation tactics had me LOLing. I was just like laughing out loud. I was like, I'm going to talk about projection, but it's like, it's such projection and irony. Like it's wild. So the one thing is, I'm going to say no one deserves to feel suicidal. Suicidal thoughts and feelings should never be weaponized against anybody. It's grossly problematic behavior. The third thing I'm going to say is that certain personality types use threats of suicidal ideation as a method of manipulation. Some personality types do that. And I'm not going to be super specific about that. But people, so the general thing that I'm going to say here is that people who have a history of using manipulative behaviors to control people in relationships, maybe some narcissistic tendencies and things like that, those people can say that they're suicidal to engage someone back and to try to maintain that power and control back. Okay, so people accuse Tom of doing that. Here's what I'm going to say. All I can say is that only Tom knows his true feelings and inner experience. I cannot in good conscience say anything about whether Tom did that or not, because only he knows his true feelings and intentions. And he did experience a lot of, so much hate, as he fumbled the explanation of the George Floyd comparison, which I am going to talk about that because oy vey. But my point is that Tom is a human being and he has experienced an excessive amount of hate. And I will say excessive because at this point, it's just like, listen, he and Rachel, they had an affair, they did something bad, they're human beings. And it's like the hate that comes from it is just, it's wild, right? And this is why Lala called some fans rabid, because I just feel that sometimes the fans take it to a level and it just becomes this whole other animal. So Tom, in my opinion, weaponized Ariana's suicidal ideation in the past and continues to continue to do that before our very eyes at the reunion. Okay. I will say that in my opinion, Tom has done that. There's irrefutable evidence that he's done that to Ariana. Okay. And so if he's going to treat her suicidal ideation that way, to me, I don't know, it doesn't bode well. But at the same time, only Tom knows what he felt, and we have to go with, what he says on this aspect of things. Okay. So I'm going to outline some resources, because the fact of the matter is, the other thing I wanted to mention about suicidal ideation is that help and resources are available. However, I know a lot of folks who have tried 988 or some of these other like crisis text line, and it's not a perfect situation. Sometimes there's wait times, and much like in mental health, in therapy and things like that, it depends who you get. And, we are experiencing post COVID, there's a lack of enough people going into mental health or in the mental health field. And so sometimes I just want to say that there are some gaps in these services. And the reason why I want to say that is just because I don't want people to get discouraged. I've had some people come to me and talk about these experiences that they've had. And it's like, I said this last episode about, Jackson, the therapist. And the thing is that you have to understand that your mental health, it's not going to be a smooth ride getting that treated. It's like anything else. I have mental health and physical health issues. And sometimes you go to the doctor and the appointment is useless. There's nothing worse than paying a copay for an appointment that you're like, this is terrible. But we can't give up on ourselves, is what I'm saying. So the reason I'm going to list some resources is that if you've done some of these and they didn't work for you, there are other resources available. And resources are not a one size fits all approach. That's why there are other things aside from the 988 Lifeline. So 988 is a 24/7 crisis hotline. You can go to 988lifeline.org or call or text 988. Or you can chat 988lifeline.org, and veterans press 1 when calling. Then there's a crisis text line. You text TALK, TALK, to 741-741. And it says to text with a trained crisis counselor from the crisis text line for free 24/7, which again, a lot of these people are volunteers. They're volunteering their time. So when they say they're trained, they're not a therapist, but they're going to be trained in how to manage crisis. But at the end of the day, what I always say is that whether you are a trained therapist, a trained crisis counselor, we're only as good as the individual, right? And so we know that whatever field it is, whether it's doctors, lawyers, therapists, teachers, whatever, there's good and bad actors in all scenarios. So my point is that please know there's other resources. Please don't give up if you come into contact with a situation that doesn't make you feel great. And just know that there are people out there who care and do want to help. So then I learned that there's a veterans crisis line, which is you send a text. It didn't specify, so I guess any text, to 838-255. And then there's Vets for Warriors. And there's the substance abuse treatment hotline, which is 1-800-662-HELP. And I mentioned RAINN before, RAINN. It's the National Sexual Assault Hotline. That's 1-800-656-HOPE. yeah, I'm working on compiling a really significant list of resources, and I'm posting them on my Instagram page, Your Bish Therapist on Instagram. So I have some things up there already. I have a list of grief books that I know people have reached out and said have been really helpful. And by the way, I also take recommendations because I'm not, you all are the ones who are in the trenches. So if you have any recommendations for grief books that really worked for you, please let me know, or any books, resources at all. I appreciate that. So let's go on to Tom's example, giving an explanation of his intention behind using the George Floyd comment as an example of how ridiculous the news coverage of Scandival became. Here's what irritated me about this. Lala spoon fed him his excuse, and it was like, I think myself and a lot of other people, when we were listening to it, we were like, why does Lala feel she needs to be the Sandoval translator all of a sudden? I don't get that. Why? And you handed him this excuse on a silver platter. I'm not convinced this is where he was going with it. I'm convinced that this is Lala gave him something that sounded great in the moment. He was like, yeah, that. But it's an important thing to talk about. So, despite his intention, which again, only he knows, I'm not psychic, I don't know it, I'm not going to claim that I know it. So, what he was trying to say is that he really inarticulate, he's very inarticulate, and he fumbled the explanation, but also it was apparent to me that like the video or the article was clickbaity. Andy and some of them talked about how the article explained what he was trying to say, but the title is always, Mandy explained when I was talking with Mandy Slutzker that the articles are written by different people than who write the headline. And so sometimes the headline is clickbaity to draw you in, but then if that's why you have to read the article. That's how, I'll post something on social media and I'll write something in the caption and people will just react, and I'm like, you didn't read this. Like, people online, they love to take one snippet of information because they don't want to read, they don't want to listen, they just want to take one teeny little snippet, interpret it any way they want, and then scream into the void. And that is, don't even get me started, that is the problem with so many things. But what Lala spoon fed Tom is that essentially he was saying, there are so many more real issues in this world, like serious issues. There's the war in Ukraine, the genocide going on in Palestine and Israel, and racism and sexism, and just all of these horrible, awful things, sex trafficking, all of these awful things. So in the scheme of things, right? In the scheme of all of these awful world events and things that are going on in this country, it seemed the fervor around Scandival seems silly. It does. But putting George Floyd's name anywhere in there was clearly inappropriate, massive misstep. He was murdered on live television, and or not live television, but it was being recorded. It was just one of those times where all of us, I think, had to look around and say, is this real life? Like Mandy's podcast, is this real life? I wonder if that's where she got the name of it. Well, I'm sure she got it from some other news situation that was similarly as awful. But so yes, to a point, but also like we have to be mindful of this man and his family and the legacy, and just not tarnishing that at all or trying to make any comparisons with that. So that fell flat, but that's kind of my 2 cents on that. Now, Katie talking about intent versus impact, in my opinion, was important, but it is important to note that when it comes to racism and comments that Tom made about George Floyd, it doesn't matter intent. It's like we can't use ignorance as an excuse to continually make ignorant comments, right? We have to, once we know better, we have to do better. So intent versus impact was a great note. I just don't know that it completely applied to this specific comparison, but in general, yes. So the intent is how you think or feel. And impact is how your actions make another person feel. So, although Tom explained what he meant, Katie's point is that if we unintentionally hurt others, despite no ill intent, we still must be accountable and adjust accordingly. And Katie is 100% correct. I say this all the time in terms of when we have pain and we have trauma, we didn't cause it, but it is our responsibility to fix it, because then we're just slinging our pain on other people and accidentally hurting others because of our struggle to manage our pain, right? So it's like we may not have caused it, but we do have to deal with it. And I'm going to go into the Katie and Lala situation when it comes to intent versus impact, because I think Lala definitely, she says things from a place of hurt, but then the way she may not have ill intent, but then the way she impacts people is wild. So here's my take on the whole Katie Lala argument. I think Katie was venting to Lala, which girlfriends, do this, right? When you're mad at your significant other, or you're mad at a friend or whatever, you vent to a friend about that. And it's a totally normal process. And we should be able to vent to our friends and to trust that they're not going to weaponize this and share a private conversation without any context. And in my opinion, that's what Lala did. She shared a private conversation where Katie was venting, because she was mindful of Ariana's struggles. But Katie's a human being, right? So she's still going to have feelings about things that are going on. And the thing is that feelings don't move in rational channels. Dolores Catania always says that. And she's right. And I just love it. And so I think sometimes it's like we all have feelings about things, and sometimes we say things we don't mean. And Katie was sharing that privately with Lala. And then, my opinion, Lala personalized it and misread Katie's intentions and then threw her under the bus in the process. So, in my opinion, Lala is triggered by perceived disingenuous behavior. And so, when she perceives someone as being disingenuous, meaning like they're saying something to her and then saying something else, she gets emotionally hijacked and she sees herself as this wild truth teller. But the problem is when this happens, she's speaking from a place of emotion and ends up saying rude comments and making herself look like a bully. Because, Lala admitted that she tends to project. And this is what I believe that we're seeing. Projection is the process of displacing our feelings onto either a different person, animal, or object. And when Lala is hurt, she feels a lot of emotions, but she forgets that these feelings aren't always facts. So that's an important thing that I've always talked about in my practice, is that a feeling isn't always a fact. Sometimes we feel a certain way. We feel slighted. We feel judged. We feel misheard. But that may not be a fact. That may just be how we feel. And the thing that I don't like about Lala and Katie sometimes too is that when they get upset, they do have a sharp tongue. That's where I think people say that Katie's miserable. I don't think she's miserable at all. I think she has her fingers on the pulse of really what's going on. She's not going to throw a friend under the bus for some dude. She's just not going to do that. I just really enjoy Katie. And people, I think there is a tinge of misogyny underneath the whole Katie's miserable thing. It's like, and this might be controversial, but I think that women in general, we get painted with this brush of like, unless we're, hey, like super pleasant and smiley and like, just like ready to meet everybody's needs, like we get painted as miserable women. And it's like, are we though? I don't think so. You don't have to be a super happy, smiley, like ready to meet everybody's needs, people pleaser to be like a good woman. And I think Katie is just getting painted with a misogynistic brush, and I just don't like it. But listen, I know some people who have strong opinions about it, and I'm not saying my perspective is the only one that's right. Even though People love to say that about me. I welcome lots of other opinions. I love agreeing to disagree or hearing other people's perspectives because I don't want to be in an echo chamber. Other opinions are what makes things interesting, and it does help me see other points of view. So this is just my view, but please feel free to share your views with me. And I'm not saying I'm always right. I'm not Oz. Do your research, think your own things. So there you have it. But yeah, I think that's the situation with Katie and Lala, is that, what I don't like is that Lala, she does these reads that she really thinks are going somewhere, but they're just self-protective bullying. And to me, it falls really flat. I think that Lala has felt that she's needed to protect herself for a long time. And so she does that by puffing up her chest. And there's animals in nature who, when they are in danger, they literally physically change. There's some birds, they puff up their chest, their feathers, kind of come up. And I feel like that when Lala does a read, it's like she's just unable to say, my feelings are hurt and I'm upset about what you've said. Instead, she has to come up with lines that she thinks are hilarious. Like, instead of something about her, it's nothing about her because you have nothing. And it's like, okay, well, that fell flat. And also, like, the sandwich shop is, like, there's proof that it's up and running. So, like, you kind of missed the mark there. But again, Lala has every reason to feel whatever she feels. But the problem is the way that she says it. And as she likes to say, the way she moves, right? She moves in ways that are, not so good sometimes. Okay. So the last thing, before I talk about the grooming situation, that I'm going to say is that, okay, so the whole Rachel situation. Oh, goodness, this is the most effective way of unifying a group of people with a disparate set of goals is to identify a common enemy. And apparently her name is Rachel. James apologizing for bringing her into the group and everyone having a laugh seemed really gross, in my opinion, because it just allows James and Tom to skirt accountability and the role they played. Like, James was engaged to this woman. He proposed to her, and Tom actively participated in that proposal. Okay. And Tom actively participated in this affair, and they want to act like she's the like she's the only problem. It's just really easy to continue to throw someone who's not on the show under the bus. And here's my 2 cents on this, okay? Rachel is a human being. And all I can say is what I know, because as I just mentioned, when we're watching things on TV, we don't know. We don't know. But I was a guest on Rachel's podcast. For people who don't know that and are surprised by that, yes, you can go back and listen. I don't remember which one it was. We talked about grooming. Hello. So that's why I have information on grooming, because I went on Rachel's podcast to discuss grooming after, that was brought up on Vanderpump Rules, and it was incorrectly discussed. All I can say is that when I was a guest on Rachel's podcast, I met her, I talked with her, and all I can say is that, to me, she took accountability for her role. She seemed to take action by going to treatment, leaving the show, and that's all I know, okay? So continuing to make Rachel a punchline is low-hanging fruit, and to me, it gets old, right? Rachel has said to me directly, she takes accountability. I am a good judge of, when I meet with someone, kind of understanding, are they being truthful? Are they not being truthful? And all I can say is that she's a human being who knows that she royally fucked up and is looking at her behavior to say, how did this happen? And how can I not do this again? So what's wild to me here is that, who's not doing that? Tom Sandoval. And how do I know that? Because we can say a lot of things, but our behaviors truly tell the story. Now, I know that people have said, I haven't listened to all of Rachel's podcast, And I'm going to be frank, I don't get to listen to anybody's podcast anymore because I'm so busy doing my own, and I'm doing content, and I'm editing and all of it. It takes all of my time. So I don't get to listen to podcasts. But when I was in person with her face to face, she walked the walk, she talked the talk, and that's all I can tell you. I just feel like continuing to blame her for everything and use her as a punchline is, how long is this going to go on? I know that it hurt her feelings. And I'm not speaking for her because that's her job to do. She's going to be talking about this on her podcast. And the other thing that I'm going to say about this is that one thing I did mention on the podcast with Mandy is that I do believe that Rachel has a couple folks around her that are utilizing her for their agenda. And I'm not going to be specific, but that is my belief. And so the reason why I'm saying that is that she also still has work to do, because I think she's still vulnerable to manipulation. And listen, when we're in a situation that is really bad, we don't go to treatment and then just like poof, it's a light switch. Like, healing isn't a light switch that you turn on or off. It's a linear process that's a roller coaster that goes up and down, and it takes a really long time. It probably took me 40 years. So, and Rachel's, a young woman. So I just want to say that Tom and Rachel are both human beings. And at some point, whether you love them or hate them, it's just like enough already. And we just have to move forward. Some of the continued hate in the comments, are so ridiculous. So, for example, I had posted something about grooming and Rachel reposted it. And I had trolls come to my page to talk to me about, well, what kind of therapist are you? And you should lose your license, and you're unethical, and blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, I can't say this one more time, but here it goes. If what I was doing is unethical, I wouldn't be doing it, because I wouldn't jeopardize something I've worked for my whole life for this. I wouldn't. I don't care about being famous at all. In fact, I completely stopped doing video and stopped doing my YouTube. I just want to share my experience, strength, and hope, and use these shows as a way to talk about really important clinical concepts. That's I as I've healed, I like to share my healing journey with others, personally and professionally, to help other people. And so me outlining that Rachel is a human who's deserving of like enough already with all this hate, and Tom too. Like, I'm going to say the same thing for him. I don't always agree with Tom, and I think, sometimes he has some stuff there, but at the same time, they're human beings, and it's like we just have to move on from the hate and the bullying and all of this other stuff, because it's just wild. Okay, so let me now talk about grooming, because Tom said, the whole thing about grooming is that Rachel said on her podcast that she feels that she was groomed by Tom. She asked me directly what I thought. I was really clear with her that I certainly cannot answer that. It's not appropriate. She's not my client. He's not my client. I cannot even begin to judge that. It's just not appropriate for me to do so. By the way, if I did, that would be unethical. But so I'm going to give you a definition of grooming, and then what some misinformation about it. I'm going to talk about that. Grooming is manipulative behaviors that the abuser uses to gain access to a potential victim, coerce them to agree to the abuse, and reduce the risk of being caught. While these tactics are used against younger kids and teens, vulnerable adults are also at risk. So let me say super clearly, and this is facts, is that adults can be groomed 1,000%. And to those people who are maybe rolling their eyes or like, no, let me explain this. In therapy, One of the first things that you learn and you start to understand is that trauma, whether it's trauma or substance abuse, the age that you start experiencing these things, most people get developmentally stuck. I talked about this with Rachel. I've talked about this with Monica. They experience things at very um, uh, important points in their adolescence. They had trauma, they had, certain experiences. And so there sometimes, a lot of times, is a huge difference between a chronological age, which is the age that you are biologically, and the developmental age that you are. So, for example, someone could be chronologically 43, but they started using substances when they were 13. And so, Monica Garcia is a good example of this. Monica Garcia seems developmentally stunted, in my opinion. And I've said this on podcasts that I've done about her and her mom called Listen Linda. And I did another podcast about her on Vial Files. And I can tell when she talks that she is developmentally stunted. And we can only do better once we know better, but sometimes it's hard for people to understand that this is what's happening for them. And so you may have a chronological age of 30 years old and still be vulnerable to grooming. In fact, I am going to cover baby reindeer. And I'm not going to give any spoilers, but what I'm saying is that, well, I guess this is a little bit of a spoiler, but in baby reindeer, it shows how a grown adult man can be groomed. And it displayed it extremely well. It was, to me, a masterpiece in terms of how grooming can happen with males and how males are treated so much worse than female victims, and female victims who are listening to this who know how badly we're treated. It's worse for men for sure when it comes to sexual abuse. And I just think Baby Reindeer showed that brilliantly. So I am going to cover that. It may be the series finale, but I'm not totally sure. So my point is that Tom is absolutely wrong. Adults can be groomed. And I hope that I've explained the reason that that can happen. Our trauma makes us vulnerable. When we have unresolved trauma that we don't work on, it makes us vulnerable to people with certain personality types. So before I talked about how empaths and narcissists are often drawn to one another. I talked about that because there are certain personality types. And to be clear, someone who's a groomer, they have psychopathology, hands down, without a doubt. Grooming is not just like someone's having a bad day. This is like psychopathology, like someone is a legit predator. Okay. So, and grooming is usually employed by a family member or someone else close to the victim's circle of trust. And that's why it's like, you hear all these stories about people who were sexually abused by, family members, friends of the family, and nobody ever suspected anything because for a long time, societally, we just looked the other way and assumed that, well, if you go to church and you seem like a good person, you are. But unfortunately, groomers use a lot of masks and different tactics. BTK, for example, and that's why I said the thing about church. Not that people who go to church are all bad. Listen, I'm just saying that, BTK, he was the picture of a great family man. BTK stands for bind, torture, kill. He was Dennis Rader. He was a serial killer for so long. And he just managed to live this life because he was married. He had kids. He seemed to be a good dad. He was a scout leader. He was a leader of his church. And so my point is that groomers know how to mask. They know how to camouflage. They know how to hide in plain sight. And when you have certain people like me, who I'm like a pathology sniffing dog, I'm not joking. I can sniff it out. Absolutely positively, not literally sniff it. That would be weird, but I can just sense it. And the thing is that when, there's a lot of people talking about psychopathology without having experienced it. And when you've experienced it, whether you grew up with it or you see it in therapy or what have you, you just learn to be able to identify some like red flags, which maybe I'll do another episode on that, but we're already 45 minutes in, so I have to move on. Okay, so though grooming can take many different forms, it often follows a similar pattern. So number one pattern is victim selection. Abusers often observe possible victims and select them based on ease of access to them and their perceived vulnerability. So if you see a child who's waiting on the front step, or their parents, they're in active addiction and they're not paying close attention, there's a lot of different ways that these groomers can be really savvy. Gaining access and isolating the victim. Abusers will attempt to physically or emotionally separate a victim from those protecting them. So this also happens with domestic violence, which is the isolation is key, because if you're isolated, you're not going to get help. Who are you going to tell? People aren't going to believe you. Like, I cannot emphasize enough how much groomers it's like they're geniuses for something really terrible. Like if they put all of this psychopathology, if we could flip it, like they could cure cancer. They're that adept. They're that calculated. They're that, I don't want to say intelligent, but in ways they're that intelligent to understanding how to victimize people. And this is why when people talk about being victims and being hard on themselves, you have to understand the groomer is better at this than you are at protecting yourself. That's how it is. They are, this is an Olympic sport for them. They're practiced. They've done it time and time again. You can be the smartest, emotionally intelligent person and be a victim of this. And so I hope that validates many people listening to this. A couple other things is trust, development of trust and keeping secrets. So I have said from the beginning of this podcast is secrets keep us sick. And if anyone is asking you to keep a secret, it's not good. No secret keeping. No. And this isn't like a friend talking to a friend being like, well, I don't know, like a small thing, but in sincerity, even small things are not good. So it's like, hopefully you know what I mean and what I don't, but abusers will attempt to gain trust of a potential victim through gifts, attention, sharing secrets, and other means to make them feel that they have a caring relationship and to train them to keep the relationship secret. They're literally training them. And it happens so incrementally and so small at first that people don't even recognize it. So and the gift and attention thing, this can also be known as love bombing. That is a component that can cross over from grooming to, domestic violence and things like that, because that's usually a huge part of it. The isolation, the making someone feel really special before flipping that ugly switch. Because here's how this works. It's called cognitive dissonance. Okay. So if somebody is in a relationship with someone and they feel that they're getting all this love and attention, and then the person starts to be mean or bully or do something, it creates a cognitive dissonance in our brain where we say, but they were just so good to me. So maybe I'm making this up. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe groomers get victims to self-gaslight, and this is how they do it. Another big thing is desensitization to touch and discussion of sexual topics. This will always be a part of the grooming process. An attempt by abusers to make their behavior seem natural to avoid raising suspicion. There are also some differences between online grooming is usually adults hiding who they are to groom children. But then with grooming, there is also an aspect where the groomer grooms the family and the community. So going back to BTK, serial killer, his community, his church community, his family, they were all completely shocked because he also groomed them too. and it's a lot. Okay. So let me just see if there's anything else to say about VPR, because I definitely need to move on to the Valley. I think that, you know what I wanted to talk about really quickly? Postpartum OCD. I wanted to talk about that quickly, and then I wanted to give a couple of resources before I move on to the Valley. So I'm definitely probably not going to be able to talk about Summer House, but so here's what upset me about the Vanderpump Rules Reunion Part 1. They did list a 988 slide at the end, but here is the subtle misogyny that irritates me, that it just they put that at the end, but they never put any resources for postpartum depression or OCD or any postpartum resources. Please explain that to me. And as I mentioned, it's good to put 988, but 988 doesn't work for everybody, and there are lots of other resources. So I guess I feel very passionate about this topic, clearly, because I don't think it's appropriate to show really challenging things and then to not give people a place to go. Now, I understand we are in the age of the internet, right? When I was growing up, that didn't exist. Now, if you want postpartum OCD resources, you can easily just Google it. But I guess my point is that I feel there is kind of some misogynistic undertones in what Bravo feels it's important to give a resource slide about and what's not. So I'm going to talk a little bit about postpartum OCD, because last time I did this, people were really appreciative. Postpartum OCD is similar to traditional OCD. However, its symptoms involve the parent's thoughts and behaviors specifically towards or about the newborn. It is a type of postpartum anxiety disorder that can also start while pregnant, which most people didn't know, which is called peripartum OCD. And it's characterized by intrusive thoughts and behaviors that are in response to a perceived danger toward the child. These thoughts and behaviors are constant and repetitive and can severely disrupt daily life. Postpartum OCD is a severe condition that requires treatment to manage and control symptoms. And here's the statistics on this. Postpartum OCD affects anywhere between 3 to 5% of women after giving birth, but it also affects fathers. And by the way, not everyone is in a heteronormative relationship. So it affects people irrespective of gender and sexual orientation and things like that, is what I'm saying. It's not uncommon, but it's under. So here's the thing. The 3 to 5% is saying that it's not common, but postpartum OCD is likely underdiagnosed and overlooked. Case in point, what I just said about Scheana, she reported when most practitioners don't know the difference. And there's like I said, there's good and bad actors in all situations and circumstances. And sometimes, unfortunately, people go to a primary care physician for a mental health issue, and people who are PCPs, they get very little education and knowledge about mental health, if I'm being honest. So it's good to go to a professional. You have to go to an expert when you're dealing with something that not everybody is going to understand. Because what happens is women and men and non-binary people, everybody, what happens is you feel shame and embarrassment. And especially women who have just had a baby, you feel such shame about, well, I'm going to lose my baby if I speak up. Because if you're having thoughts about harming your child that you know you're not going to do, but it's like an obsessive compulsive, like a repetitive thought, that is so scary to be in that alone. So please know, there are people who can help you. You're not going to lose your child. You're not going to be gaslit, but you have to go to the right person. So here's some resources, postpartum.net. And there's another great site specifically for postpartum OCD, which is iocdf.org. Here's the other thing that I'm going to say about Scheana and her postpartum OCD. So she talked about living in the comment section, which is literally not healthy for anybody, number one. And number two, I did a podcast with Lindsay Lime about this, how she talked about she was on a psychotropic medication, and then she went off because she wanted to microdose and that didn't help. And so it's just a reminder that psychedelic assisted therapy isn't going to be the only treatment for this that's going to work. Like, you're going to have to use a lot of tools in your tool belt. Like, if you're expecting to do one thing, that's and this is leading into my comments about Jesse in the Valley. Psychedelic assisted trauma therapy is a new thing, and I did a podcast episode about it. But my point is that we also have to be mindful of our behaviors. So not only do I think Scheana is missing there's some holes in her treatment regimen from what she said. I don't know what it is now. And my God, I hope she's happy. And only she and her practitioner know. But my point is that we have to use all of our tools in our tool belt, and we also have to be mindful of our behaviors. If you're struggling with any sort of mental health issue, living in the comment section is going to be a disaster for you. It's going to make everything worse. And I just know this because I have to be on Instagram, and sometimes I sincerely hate it so much, and it's not good for my mental health, and I have to take breaks. It's just not a healthy, it's like the Wild West. It's just not healthy. Okay, so now let me move over to the Valley because, my God, it's been almost an hour. But clearly I had so much to say about this. Okay, here's the thing with the Valley. The first thing that I want to talk about is Jesse. Speaking about half measures. So Jesse did some sort of 24-hour psychedelic assisted therapy, and he came back and he was talking to Michelle about it. And here's what's interesting for me about Jesse is that Jesse said, and I quote, "I usually go into things like this asking myself how I can manipulate it." It's like, and then he also said, "I feel completely different. I feel like there's been an ego death." And he's talked about how he has a big ego. And the strange thing about Jesse is that for somebody who has some really concerning personality characteristics and traits, he seems to have a weird amount of insight. And that is the thing that always blows my mind with him, because people want to label him this or that. And I'm not even going to repeat because that's not what I do. But usually people with certain personality traits similar to Jesse's, they just can't get there. But he can. So I don't know. Jesse does fascinate me in that way. But when he said about he felt ego death, and Michelle said that big ego was going to be hard to kill, I just laughed so hard. I was like, she's just like so sick of him, and she just can't stand him. And I think that what I'm seeing is that she's clearly has one foot out the door, but he's just so insistent on keeping the family together that I think she's not even on board with it. She's just like tolerating it. So I'm not at all surprised. If they didn't get divorced, I would have been shocked. So here's the thing I want to say about Jesse. He is the king of not even half measures, like quarter measures. He is someone who needs every tool in the tool belt to really address the issues that he has. And it's not just issues with his wife. Case in point, at the beach, when he is literally like assaulting, like play fighting with Michelle, but also with Danny. And the preview for next episode shows Danny being upset about it and kind of saying, like, I didn't like the way that you put your hands on my body. But in this episode, Jesse says, like, he starts making these comments about how Danny is the most sensitive man he's ever met. And I literally wrote in all caps, "And he's the only one who's happily married." Like, I wrote it in all caps because it's like, I cannot with Jesse and Jax. I cannot with them. It's like, you are not with your partners because you both are so unwell and you refuse to look at it, and you just spread your pain and you spread your bullshit on people, and this is not the way to live. Jesse and Jax desperately do anything to avoid actually looking at themselves. And I've said this a million times, the only way out is through. I'm, as a trauma survivor, a patient and a professional, I've seen people, and I've done this myself, try every way to go around, underneath, over, build a bridge, take an Uber. You can't get around the pain. The only way out is through. And I understand the desire to try to take shortcuts. Trust me, I do. But it just isn't going to work. I think that, Jesse is just the type of person that until he emotionally matures and deals with some of these issues, he's just not going to be able to be a good partner. He'll find someone else. He already has. But whoever he finds, eventually, unless they have a lot of trauma too, and this sort of personality works for them, they're going to get sick of this as well. And what I want to say about Danny is that I love Danny and Nia so much. There's just toxic men on Bravo, and Danny is such a breath of fresh air. If someone touches your body and you don't like the way that they're touching it, and you tell them that and they just say you're too sensitive, they're not your friend. They're not your friend. That's insanity. Like, nobody, I mean, this is basic stuff we teach kids, right? I just had a conversation with my 6-year-old niece about this because I am that aunt who will talk about these things, age appropriately. But nobody should be putting their hands on your body. And if somebody does, you tell an adult and you let them know, stop touching my body. So we have to talk about these things, and we have to, understand that, like, again, it's impact versus intent, like Katie said. So perhaps Jesse's intent was to play fight, but the impact was you hurt your wife and you made Danny feel very uncomfortable. So you have to look at that, but he doesn't want to look at that because that means taking accountability. Okay. Now let's go on to Jackson Brittany, because I am going to have a literal clinical dissertation for next episode because we saw the preview. So in this episode, Brittany clearly has GI issues. Like, poor Brittany is clearly not well. She talked about in the car having a weak stomach. She had her gallbladder removed. She's had these issues her whole life. So as someone who has had chronic health issues, for most of my life, what I will say is that people, and this is a totally unpopular take that I have not heard many people talk about, people love to blame people who are sick, and because people don't understand it. It's like, I hear people on the internet like, oh, well, Brittany was told that she needed to stop drinking and do this and do that. And it's like, here's I'm going to give a PSA for people who live with a chronic illness. People have told me you shouldn't eat any sugar. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't do that. Guess what? A lot of people with healthy privilege have a lot of opinions about how people should behave when they aren't sick. And let me tell you something. Brittany has struggled with this her whole life. And, I don't drink, right? I don't drink because I don't like it and it's not good for my body. But if it was something that I enjoyed, I might have a drink every now and again. Now, would that be the best thing for me? Probably not. But I'm a human being who deserves to live a life that feels right for me, right? So everyone blaming Brittany here is just like, it's making me so angry. The fact of the matter is that she has a stomach condition. She has GI issues. Do I agree that she probably should attend to those in a way that serves her best, because it's just not fun to feel like that? Yeah, I do think that. But I'm also not going to sit here and shame her. Brittany is a mother who is on a show where this is what's happening. People are drinking. She's trying to have fun. She's also managing a son who has more developmental needs than anticipated. And she has a husband who is literally not supportive at all. Okay. So I believe that some of her drinking is related to feeling unhappy, which isn't fantastic. But my point is that Brittany is self-neglecting because I think she is trying to keep the relationship and her child afloat. And I think she's neglecting herself in the process. And as she's neglecting herself in the process, she is getting judged by every single person, especially her husband, who, when she says in the car that she has to keep this from Jax, and I forget, I think it was Janet, maybe someone was like, that's not a good sign. And it's like, yeah, if I couldn't come home and tell my husband like I'm sick and have him rub my feet and get me tea and all that, like I would feel super alone. So I think Brittany feels very alone. And I do think sometimes with physical health issues and mental health issues, it's a chicken or the egg scenario, which is like, I have depression, PTSD, and chronic illness. All those things are real. But when I am in a depressive state, or if I'm having some struggle with my post traumatic stress, my pain is worse. And it's not that I'm making up either. It's just that the body keeps the score. And when you're having an emotional scenario or situation that you are not fully addressing, your body's going to experience that. So I think this is a combo of of a whole bunch of things with Brittany. But what I do notice to kind of show my point about the body keeps the score, which is a book that I always recommend, by the way. Brittany usually gets sick after confrontations with Jax. It doesn't mean that it's not valid, but we just have to look at how stress impacts our bodies. And I'd be willing to make an educated guess that her GI system has improved since their separation. I'm going to guess. But and listen, I wish Brittany well, and I do hope she stops self-neglecting and taking care of herself because, going back to misogyny and postpartum OCD not being talked about, well, this is another thing that doesn't get talked about. Women are expected to be superhuman when they have a child. That, Brittany is, they're clearly trying to figure out what's going on with their child. Um, you know, with his developmental needs and getting some early intervention, which is key. But she is just women are expected to give it all to everybody else and then have nothing left for themselves. And then it's like people are criticizing her and it's like, get off her jock, man. Like, being a parent is hard. Trying to keep a little person alive is hard. Trying to, when a child is sick, whether it be mentally, physically, whatever, it's hard. And she's doing it alone, as evidenced by, they get videos about their son crying, which, like, I do have questions about that. Why did the caretaker send those videos of him crying? Because I just feel like that is stressful and I'm not sure how that's helpful. But, seeing Jax have a meltdown, hearing his son cry, here's my take on this. He cannot emotionally regulate and tolerate his own emotions, so he can't tolerate his son's emotions. He literally walks away to avoid his son's emotions. And then he talks to Brittany in a way that is verbally abusive. I'm going to say that. The way he talks to her isn't love. I mean, it's week after week after week, him yelling at her, talking to her nasty, speaking to her in a way that everyone's like, I wouldn't talk to my dog like that. What, so that is verbally abusive behavior. I'm not saying that Jax is that. I'm saying that's the behavior, and it's not love. So Jax says to her, you know how to handle it. It works for you. And it's like, well, okay, that doesn't make any sense. And then another peek I got behind the curtain of this is that the preview for next episode, Jax puts his head, Brittany is like sleeping, she's sick, she's not well, and Jax like opens the door and he says to her, like, everyone else is out here being cool, so just be normal. And a little light in my brain went off, and I'm like, and this is why he's having such a hard time with his son, because he is gaslighting himself and Brittany about what is quote unquote normal. And let me tell you, I try to avoid the word normal like the plague, because what the hell is normal? It's like we have statistics will tell us that there's statistically, there's a bell curve. And so in the middle, there's like the norm, I just said it, is the typical what you would expect of behavior. And then there's standard deviations outside of that. So there are statistical ways to look at what's common, what's not common. But in terms of like normal, what is normal? Normal doesn't exist. Normal is something that emotionally repressed people or people of an older generation, they try to slap that term on it, and it's gaslighting, it's invalidating, it's nothing good usually ever comes of it. And so I'll be interested to see what that scene looks like, because I just saw the preview, but my therapist brain just made the connection that I think that Jax is judging himself, Brittany, and their child about normal. And it's like, all children are beautiful. And listen, I've worked with children who are neurodivergent, and neurodivergence, by the way, Joe was completely out of pocket when she talked about neurodivergence just being ADHD, or I forget exactly what she said, but she was like, neurodivergence is just one thing. And it's like, dude, you have no idea. So neurodivergence is a category of, and it contains many different diagnoses. So ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, different things. Okay. I'm not going to go into that because I know I'm really stretching the time here, but I think that some of the most amazing people that I've ever met have been neurodivergent because their brains work differently. And I believe that our differences and the different ways that we think is what makes the world a beautiful place. Like, wouldn't it be boring if we were all like, quote unquote, normal, or, saying the same stuff? It's like, I think it's a comment from Jax that just shows how judgmental he is towards self and others. And so his stuff with his son, it's like projection. He's like projecting, and he just can't handle it. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about from the Valley is the whole Zach and Kristen not being invited, and the conversation that Janet had with her friends, who I really enjoy Jared. So Jared is, friends with the VPR people, and he was on that episode where Janet was talking to Zach on the phone. And it was he and one of their other friends who was known as Harriet the Spy. For people who are my age, I think that was like a really popular show, like for maybe people around my age or a little bit younger, but it was just like such a hilarious callback. But his name is Simon, Harriet the Spy. His name is Simon. So here's my thought on this. I think that there is other stuff going on behind the scenes between Zach and Janet. So, for example, there was something that came up on social media the other day about Janet made some accusations about things that Zach and Kristen said about like her child. And I didn't write it down because I just didn't have time. So I'm not going to repeat it because I don't know exactly what it was. But so my point is that Janet was saying she was really angry with Zach and Kristen for saying these things. And so it seemed like maybe there was some more pieces to the puzzle between why she was talking to Zach the way she was. But like, it did look like mean girl behavior. And I think that getting Jax to do her bidding about like not inviting Zach and Kristen, like I didn't love that either. Having the friend eavesdrop is like a hard no for me. I just don't think that's cool. And Janet wasn't super honest about it either. She claimed initially that she just like had Harriet the Spy go over there to like take the temp of the room. And then later she said, knowing she did admit that she asked her friend to go over there knowing people were crying and she was being nosy. And she also then immediately mentioned Kristen after having this big speech in the kitchen about like not talking about Kristen. So I just think that sometimes Janet talks out of both sides of her mouth. And I didn't like her behavior towards Zach. However, I will say that again, reality TV is not always reality. So perhaps there are other things going on behind the scenes, but how she talked to Zach didn't seem like it was just about this. As a therapist, I've gotten really good at understanding when there's like a more emotional reaction, you think it's about situation A, but it's actually about situation A, B, C, and D. And maybe there was unresolved issues that, she didn't address or want to address. And so, to be determined on that. But the way that the episode ended is that Jax like gets all this courage to like talk to Michelle. And she was like, yeah, I met that guy for coffee and I texted people. And yeah, I did send some sexy pictures. And it's like, okay. So just as I suspected, Kristen was right. And the only person who was right about this was not on the trip because she volunteers herself to be a scapegoat because of her emotionally dysregulated behaviors. Okay. So sorry for the extra long episode. I clearly do not have time to talk about Summer House, but I'm going to talk about Summer House in complete detail with Mandy this week, and that will air next week. And thank you so much for listening. Please, just a quick note to please give the podcast a 5-star review. I did an extra episode about the Spreaker Supporters Club. So if you're curious about what that is, Spreaker Supporters Club, you get extra episodes, you get episodes without ads, and I'm working on doing early releases of episodes for podcast Spreaker Supporters Club. So if you're interested in that, please check that out. And I just want to say thank you so much. And I can't wait to have Mandy back on and talk about all of this wildness. Disclaimer, posts are not intended to diagnose, treat, or provide medical advice. Your bitch therapist is for entertainment and informational purposes only. The podcast, my opinions, and posts are my own and not associated with past or present employers, any organizations, Bravo TV, Greyheart Productions, or any other television network. The information in YBT podcast and on its social media is provided for general informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat. Please do not act or refrain from acting based on anything you read, see, or hear on YBT podcast or associated social media. Communicating with YBT via email and or social media does not form a therapeutic alliance. Melissa, operator of YBT, is unable to provide any therapeutic advice, treatment, or feedback.